The Texas sun was already fading when the wind rolled through the empty fields, carrying the smell of hay and warm dust. A woman stood beside a wooden fence, her hands roughened by years of work, her eyes the pale gray of an ocean far away. Her voice carried a soft accent when she called to the man fixing the gate, an accent that still didn't quite belong to Texas. Behind her, the land stretched endlessly, dotted with cattle and mesquite trees. But where she stood, the earth held a secret. Just beyond the tree line once stood the barbed wire fences of a World War II prisoner of war camp. It had been a place meant to hold the enemy, to keep them far from the battlefield. Yet here, in this quiet corner of America, something impossible had happened. Thousands of German prisoners had come, worked, and waited for a war to end. And among them were women who found more than freedom waiting. Some would leave, some would return. But a few, like her, would never go home again. The fences had come down, but love had built its own. By 1943, the Second World War had stretched across nearly every continent, swallowing millions of lives and resources in its wake. The Allies had begun to turn the tide. North Africa had fallen, Italy was crumbling, and the Allies were capturing more German troops than the front lines could hold. Europe's battlefields overflowed with prisoners, and the question of what to do with them grew urgent. Britain was already burdened by shortages, its own cities in ruins. The United States, still distant from the bombs and devastation of Europe, offered an answer. With its vast land, abundant resources, and relative safety, America became the unlikely host for over 400,000 German prisoners of war. They came by ship, guarded and weary, crossing the Atlantic under heavy security. When they reached American soil, many were stunned. They had expected hostility, hair, shade labor, or revenge. Instead, they found order, food, and structure, a world utterly different from the war-torn continent they had left behind. Texas, with its open plains and warm climate, soon became one of the central hubs for housing these prisoners. Nearly 70,000 Germans were sent there, scattered across more than 30 camps, each designed under the strict standards of the Geneva Convention. The camps themselves were self-contained worlds, clusters of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers and guards, often built near rural communities or army training fields. The Geneva Convention guaranteed humane treatment, so the prisoners received medical care, decent food, and even pay for their labor. In a strange way, captivity in America offered more comfort than freedom back home. As one captured soldier later wrote, "We were prisoners, but we were treated like men." To local Texans, the arrival of the Germans was something between curiosity and caution. Many communities had sons fighting in Europe, and the idea of the enemy being housed in their own backyards stirred unease. But wartime necessity overrode emotion. Farms lacked workers. Harvests were failing with so many men overseas. The government allowed prisoners to work on local farms, sawmills, and road projects under strict supervision. The arrangement suited both sides. The prisoners earned small wages. The locals kept their land productive. In the beginning, the separation between American civilians and the German prisoners was rigid. The barbed wire wasn't just physical. It was emotional, moral, and patriotic. But over time, barriers began to blur. The Germans proved disciplined, polite, and eager to work. Many were not Nazis by ideology, but by circumstance. Young men drafted into a war they no longer believed in. They spoke of homes, families, and dreams that sounded surprisingly ordinary to the Texans listening. Slowly, curiosity replaced suspicion. The Texas sky, vast and endless, had a way of softening things. The guards were often local boys, barely older than the prisoners themselves. They shared cigarettes, traded words of broken English and German, sometimes even laughter. For the prisoners, it was a life in limbo, a pause between destruction and rebuilding. They built furniture for the camps, played soccer in the heat, carved wood figures to send home. Many joined camp choirs, orchestras, and theater groups. For a few hours each evening, they escaped the label of enemy and became human again. It wasn't long before some were allowed to work beyond the fences, under contract, always guarded, but among ordinary Americans. They harvested cotton, repaired barns, and helped rebuild what the war had taken away. Farmers' wives would sometimes leave water or lemonade nearby, small gestures of civility that went against wartime propaganda. One Texas farmer's daughter later recalled, "They were boys, just like ours. Only their uniforms were different." As the war dragged on, the number of prisoners grew, and with them came not just soldiers but members of the German auxiliary services. Clerks, nurses, translators, and administrative staff, some of them women. Most were sent to special holding areas, often near larger camps. Officially, there was little contact between them and the male prisoners, but, in practice, the walls of regulation were thin. Letters passed quietly through sympathetic guards, glances met across work details, and soon whispers began to circulate. The presence of women changed everything. Their arrival was not publicized, nor was it large in number, but in the isolated expanse of wartime Texas, it was enough to stir something unexpected. Loneliness, shared labor, and mutual respect began to intertwine into something more fragile and more dangerous than simple camaraderie. By late 1944, as the Allies advanced deeper into Europe and Germany faced collapse, those who lived behind American fences began to realize they might not have a home to return to. What had started as confinement now felt like shelter. For some, the war's end would bring not freedom, but loss of stability, safety, and connection. And for a small few, it would bring the most unlikely bond of all. The land that had once imprisoned them was slowly becoming a place they couldn't imagine leaving. By early 1945, the war was collapsing in Europe, but life in the American prisoner of war camps carried on with an almost domestic rhythm. In Texas, the seasons dictated the flow of days: spring planting, summer harvest, autumn repairs, and quiet winters that stretched long and empty. The war felt distant here. Radios carried news of bombings and invasions. But in the heart of Texas, the fields still needed tending, fences needed mending, and work crews left the camps each morning as if part of the local landscape. For many Texans, these men who had once fought for Hitler were now just strongbacks under the same relentless sun. The German prisoners adapted quickly to the rhythm of rural life. They learned English words from farmers, hummed American tunes on the long truck rides to work, and found the strange freedom that came with routine. Some even sent money home through the Red Cross, small wages earned by their hands far from the ruins of Europe. The camp newspapers, printed in German under American supervision, often carried poems, essays, and reflections. They wrote not about war, but about hope, home, and the confusing kindness of their captors. To the U.S. Army, the program was a success. It kept prisoners occupied, boosted the local economy, and demonstrated the principles of the Geneva Convention to the world. But beyond policy, something far more human was happening. The distance between enemy and neighbor was shrinking. Prisoners were invited to local church services. Christmas carols were sung together under guarded lights. And in rare moments, guards and prisoners shared family photographs. The war outside the fences seemed increasingly absurd to those inside them. Among the Germans were those not from the front lines: typists, nurses, translators, and administrative clerks from captured support units. Some were women, though their presence was seldom mentioned in official records. They had been captured in Italy, North Africa, and occasionally in occupied France, assigned to non-combat duties but swept into the tide of surrender. In Texas, they were housed separately, often in small annexes to larger camps, where they performed clerical work or assisted in medical facilities treating wounded prisoners. Their existence blurred the rigid lines of military captivity. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, yet they wore the same uniformed past, carried the same uncertainty, and faced the same fences. The American guards found themselves in an unfamiliar moral space. The rules forbade personal contact beyond duty, but the sight of women behind barbed wire, nurses who had tended the wounded, secretaries who had served in offices, many barely in their 20s, stirred a quiet discomfort. The war had brought brutality and propaganda, but here, in the quiet isolation of Texas, humanity pressed through the cracks. For the local communities, curiosity grew. Newspapers occasionally printed sanitized stories about the camps, describing them as orderly, well-run, and secure. Yet everyone knew someone who had seen the prisoners at work or passed them on a country road. The Germans, polite and disciplined, often left behind a reputation that confounded the image painted by wartime newsreels. Shopkeepers recalled how they bowed slightly when spoken to. Children waved as trucks rumbled by, and farmers quietly admitted they worked harder than expected. The presence of the female auxiliaries became a kind of whispered rumor. They were rarely seen, but their existence carried an undeniable fascination. American women volunteering at nearby hospitals or Red Cross posts sometimes caught glimpses of them, fair-haired, reserved, standing in neat rows during inspections. Some locals expressed sympathy, others disapproval. But human stories have a way of escaping silence. Within months, tales began to circulate of friendships forming between guards and prisoners, and of letters passed secretly between German women and local farmhands who worked near the annexes. By the war's final months, those letters had become lifelines. For the prisoners, they were a reminder that life existed beyond orders and uniforms. For the Texans who wrote back, they were a quiet rebellion against wartime hatred. The tone of those letters was never political. They spoke of weather, work, music, and the simple yearning for peace. Many would later become the seeds of something much deeper. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, celebrations erupted across America. But inside the Texas camps, the mood was different, heavy with uncertainty. The fences no longer seemed like punishment but protection. Outside them lay a future unknown, and for the few German women who had found compassion, kindness, or even love among their captors and neighbors, the thought of leaving felt like a second imprisonment. The camps began the slow process of repatriation, but not everyone wanted to go home. For many, home no longer existed. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne were rubble. Families were scattered. The future was a question mark. Some looked at the wide Texas horizon and felt something they hadn't in years: belonging. The seeds of what would later become one of the most extraordinary stories of World War II had been planted quietly, almost accidentally, in the red soil of Texas. Behind barbed wire meant for war, the beginnings of peace and love had taken root. The story of the German prisoners in Texas cannot be understood through statistics alone. It was a story of people meeting across boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. Behind every fence was a collision of worlds, one defined by orders and loyalty, the other by freedom and open sky. When the first prisoners arrived, Texans viewed them with suspicion. Many families had sons fighting and dying in Europe, and the idea that captured Germans were being fed, housed, and even paid by the U.S. Army seemed almost unbearable. But war has its paradoxes, and soon, the reality of daily life began to soften opinions. For farmers and ranchers struggling to survive the wartime labor shortage, the arrival of POWs was practical salvation. Most of the local men were gone, serving in the Pacific or Europe, and the fields lay untended. The German prisoners worked hard, quietly, and without complaint. They repaired fences, planted cotton, picked fruit, built barns, and hauled timber. Payment for their labor went through the army, not directly to them, but they earned small credits they could use in the camp canteen. To the Texans, they were no longer faceless enemies. They were young men doing what all men in hard times do, working to get through the day. The human angle soon became impossible to ignore. Reports from guards and local residents tell of men who showed unexpected kindness. A farmer's wife, whose son was a prisoner in Germany, once admitted that she baked extra bread to send to the German work crew assigned to her fields. She said it was her way of hoping someone might do the same for her boy overseas. Acts like these began to appear quietly across the state. Meals left out on fence posts, small gifts of tobacco, the exchange of polite greetings in broken English. War propaganda began to crumble under the simple truth of proximity. For the prisoners, the shock of their treatment was profound. They had been told Americans were ruthless and cruel, that capture meant humiliation or death. Yet here they were, eating well, sleeping in clean barracks, even allowed to play soccer and music. The U.S. military followed the Geneva Convention strictly, and many Germans found themselves treated better in captivity than in their own army. They wrote home, describing kindness they could hardly believe. Some confessed shame that the enemy had shown them more humanity than their leaders ever had. This moral contrast created a quiet shift inside the camps. The guards saw the change in their charges. They no longer looked like soldiers of the Reich, but men trying to rediscover their humanity. Chaplains held services. Some prisoners attended American church gatherings. The army even encouraged educational programs, English classes, vocational training, and discussions on democracy. To the War Department, it was a form of re-education. To the prisoners, it was an opening of the world. The cultural exchanges deepened. Texans introduced the Germans to country music, barbecue, and rodeos. In return, the prisoners carved intricate wooden toys, painted murals, and performed German folk songs at community events. Local audiences came out to listen, sometimes unsure how to feel, but drawn by curiosity. Many of those who attended later said it was the first time they saw the enemy as human. In those shared moments, the mythology of war gave way to something older and simpler: understanding. Within the CEE/MPS, music and art became lifelines. The Germans built small orchestras, their instruments salvaged or donated by sympathetic guards. Sunday concerts filled the dusty air with Beethoven, Schubert, and folk songs that spoke of home. Even the guards listened in silence, moved by melodies from across the ocean. One camp in Texas became famous for its artwork. Prisoners painted murals of Bavarian villages on mess hall walls, turning gray army buildings into fragments of another world. Decades later, when the camps were long gone, those murals were still found under layers of paint, their colors faint but unforgotten. The moral angle of the story lay in these quiet acts. By treating their captives with dignity, Americans upheld something fundamental: the belief that even in war, humanity should not be lost. It wasn't generosity born of sentiment, but conviction rooted in law and conscience. And it worked. Many German POWs left the camps with changed minds. They wrote in later years that their time in America had shown them a vision of fairness that defied what they'd been taught about democracy. It didn't turn them into patriots of another flag, but it left them questioning the lies that had sent them to war. Some Texans, too, found themselves transformed. The enemy became a mirror reflecting their own compassion. They began to question how hate could survive when decency was so simple. In a time when the world was tearing itself apart, a handful of people in rural Texas discovered what reconciliation might look like. By 1945, the fences had become more symbolic than real. Inside them lived a community bound not just by war, but by the strange intimacy of shared labor and isolation. The Germans built gardens, carved chapels from scrap wood, and celebrated Christmas with the same carols the guards' families sang at home. Each small act of normalcy chipped away at the distance between them. And in the midst of that closeness, something fragile began to grow, something neither army nor government could control. In places where men and women worked side by side under the open Texas sky, where language faltered but kindness spoke clearly, emotions began to surface that had no place in military reports or official records. Compassion became affection, and affection, in time, became love. That was the next transformation waiting beyond the fences. A human story that would test not only the rules of war, but the boundaries of the heart itself. It began quietly, almost invisibly, as most forbidden things do. The Texas sun was relentless, the work constant, and the loneliness heavy on both sides of the fence. The war was ending, but life in the camps carried on. The German women who had been captured in support roles, nurses, clerks, translators, were sent to assist with administrative duties in hospitals and offices connected to the POW system. They were few, scattered across the state in small annexes near larger camps, but their presence created a ripple through the stillness. To the American soldiers and civilians around them, they were a curiosity. An unexpected reminder that the enemy had faces that smiled, eyes that looked away shyly, and hands that trembled not from malice, but from uncertainty. At first, the regulations were clear. Fraternization was full or bidden. No letters, no personal exchanges, no contact beyond duty. But the rules could not silence proximity. The war had stolen years from everyone. Years of youth, of family, of touch. Now, in this quiet corner of Texas, time seemed to stand still. Guards and prisoners spoke in short, cautious words at first. About weather, about food, about the music carried from the radio. A shared laugh might follow, then a longer glance. Each moment was small, but they began to stack like pebbles, building an unseen path towards something neither side expected. Some of the women worked as nurses in medical wards treating sick or injured prisoners. Their patients were men who had fought under the same flag, yet were now stripped of everything that defined them. Caring for them softened the edges of the camp's harshness. American doctors noted their discipline and skill, and soon, mutual respect grew between them. But outside the official hours, quiet moments began to unfold. An American soldier might help carry supplies, and a brief conversation would linger longer than it should. Notes were sometimes hidden in laundry, in crates of supplies, or slipped beneath trays. Words of gratitude turned into questions. Where are you from? Do you miss home? Do you ever think about what comes next? These small exchanges carried immense risk. Discovery could mean transfer, punishment, or worse. But they also carried a rare warmth. A reminder that compassion could bloom even where rules forbade it. One German nurse later recalled in an interview decades later, "I had lost faith in everything. Then I met someone who spoke to me as if I were still human." That feeling, to be seen, not as an enemy but as a person, became its own form of salvation. For the locals, the change did not go unnoticed. Some farmers who employed work crews from the camps spoke openly about their admiration for the prisoners' manners and work ethic. Others whispered about something more. There were stories of dances organized in nearby towns where guards and soldiers attended off-duty, and where a few German women, under supervision, helped with decorations or music. In the dim light of those halls, glances and smiles traveled farther than they should have. A waltz or a slow song could bridge a language barrier in ways words never could. The post-exchanges and chapels sometimes hosted gatherings meant to maintain morale. Here, laughter replaced suspicion. The Germans, many from middle-class or educated backgrounds, spoke of literature, art, and music, topics that drew American curiosity. They were articulate, proud, and yet vulnerable. For some young Texans, especially those who had grown up isolated in rural communities, meeting them was like discovering another world. The moral question was delicate. To love the enemy was to betray the unspoken order of wartime loyalty. Yet love has always defied orders. For many, these connections were not born of rebellion but of recognition. Both sides had endured loss, both were weary of hate, and both longed for something human amid the machinery of war. Letters between them often survived only as fragments, torn pages hidden in books or tucked away in family boxes long after the camps closed. But their words reveal a truth untouched by propaganda. "I do not know what will happen to us." One letter reads, "But when I think of you, I remember that the world can still be kind." When the war finally ended in 1945 and news of Germany's surrender reached Texas, the mood inside the camps turned somber. Freedom was promised, but to many, it felt uncertain. The German men would soon be shipped home, and the women too. Yet a few hearts had anchored themselves here. The land that had once symbolized defeat now felt like refuge. They had seen America not through the lens of politics, but through its people, fair, open, and forgiving. And some Americans too had glimpsed something profound, that compassion could survive even in captivity. The most remarkable part of this story is not that such relationships happened, but that they endured. After the war, some of the German women who were repatriated later found ways to return to the United States, sponsored by the very people they had met during captivity. A few married and settled in Texas permanently. Their stories remained mostly hidden for decades, tucked into family histories and local lore. But they existed. Proof that love could outlast ideology. In these moments, the Texas camps became more than symbols of wartime necessity. They became the stage for an extraordinary paradox. The place where the wounds of war began to heal, quietly, through ordinary human connection. What began as captivity evolved into coexistence, and for a rare few, into the deepest form of understanding. It was a strange kind of love story. One that belonged not to peace, but to the silence just after the guns stopped. And in that silence, choices would soon have to be made that would change lives forever. By the spring of 1945, Germany had fallen. The Reich was a ruin, its cities burned, its people starving. But in the heart of Texas, the war's echo reached the camps as nothing more than a whisper through radios and letters. For the prisoners, surrender brought not the thrill of victory, nor the relief of homecoming, only uncertainty. They were told they would soon be repatriated, sent back across the ocean to rebuild a homeland that no longer existed. Many walked to the edges of their camp fences at dusk, staring out toward the open plains, unsure if they felt trapped or protected. For some, the idea of going home filled them with dread. The men had families they hadn't heard from in years, houses that might have been bombed, and governments that no longer existed. The women, those few German auxiliaries who had lived and worked in the Texas annexes, faced an even more complicated truth. Returning meant going back to a defeated nation, one that would carry the weight of guilt and destruction. Here in Texas, they had found a strange kind of dignity, a gentleness that the war had stripped away. And for a few of them, they had found something more powerful than duty. They had found belonging. Among them were women like Anna and Hilda, whose stories would later be pieced together from camp archives and community testimonies. They had work, as nurses and clerks, their roles confined to paperwork and care. Yet over months, they had formed quiet bonds with Americans, a guard, a farmhand, a young soldier recovering from injury. These relationships were not born of rebellion, but of humanity. They shared books, practiced English, exchanged stories about childhoods spent oceans apart yet strangely similar. What began as gratitude slowly turned into affection, and by the time peace was declared, it was too late to undo what had been felt. The U.S. Army's orders were clear. All prisoners were to be processed for return. Trains would carry them to the East Coast, and ships would take them across the Atlantic. But bureaucracy is slow, and for months, many remained in limbo. Texas summer stretched on, long and heavy, and during those weeks of waiting, emotions deepened. Every goodbye felt final. Every conversation carried the weight of what could not be spoken aloud. Guards who had once been strict now found it harder to maintain the line. Some looked the other way when notes were passed or photographs exchanged. Others arranged for one last meeting before the transports began. There are records of prisoners giving handmade gifts, carved boxes, embroidered scarves, sketches of the Texas hills, small tokens meant to survive In the early months after the German surrender, the world was shifting faster than anyone could comprehend. Europe was rubble, and the United States, victorious yet uneasy, began to close the chapter of war. But in Texas, where the horizon met endless sky, that chapter refused to end so cleanly. The POW camps still held people, living reminders of the conflict, and among the prisoners, whispers of love and belonging had taken root. For those who had found connection across enemy lines, time was running out. The U.S. Army's repatriation orders grew more urgent. The war was over. The prisoners had to go home. Yet the human heart had no schedule. One of the final trains to leave a Texas camp carried hundreds of German prisoners. The journey to the East Coast was supposed to be their first step toward freedom, but for many, it felt like exile. Inside one of the rail cars sat a young woman who had worked in the camp infirmary. She pressed her forehead against the window as the plane slipped by, her eyes following every distant farmhouse, every piece of land that now held her story. In her pocket was a folded photograph of a man in a worn uniform, a camp guard who had once brought her books and shared stories about his family's ranch outside Waco. Their love had grown quietly, carefully, under the watch of others who pretended not to notice. Now, as the train rattled eastward, she whispered his name as if it might slow the miles between them. At the same time, he was standing on that ranch, watching the horizon in silence. The war had taken his youth. The army had given him duty, order, and a sense of belonging. But it had also taken something far greater, the chance to be with her. In letters that would never reach their destination, he wrote of the wind across the plains, the sound of cattle in the distance, the way the evening sky turned gold before fading to gray. He promised to wait, even if waiting meant years. As the trains carried the prisoners to the coast, others remained behind for a few final weeks. In those days, Texas became a strange crossroads of endings and beginnings. Guards shared coffee with prisoners. Local families brought food and said goodbye. Many had stopped seeing the Germans as enemies. They were simply people who had worked hard, treated others kindly, and suffered like everyone else. A local paper described it best. They came as prisoners, but they leave as friends. Still, for every friendship, there was a heartbreak. Some of the German women tried desperately to stay. A few even petitioned the War Department, citing humanitarian reasons, medical issues, or local sponsorship. Almost all were denied. Policy was policy. America, in its victory, could not be seen as harboring those who had worn the enemy's uniform, even if that uniform had long been shed. But a few stories slipped through the cracks. In 1946, records showed that a small number of former German prisoners were allowed to return to the U.S. through marriage, sponsorship, or employment. Among them were women who had once worked in Texas camps. They arrived not as prisoners, but as immigrants, stepping back onto American soil to reunite with the people they had once been forbidden to love. For them, the dream of return was not born of politics, but of something deeply human, the desire to belong to the place where their hearts had found peace. In the early months after the German surrender, the world was shifting faster than anyone could comprehend. Europe was rubble, and the United States, victorious yet uneasy, began to close the chapter of war. But in Texas, where the horizon met endless sky, that chapter refused to end so cleanly. The POW camps still held people, living reminders of the conflict, and among the prisoners, whispers of love and belonging had taken root. For those who had found connection across enemy lines, time was running out. The U.S. Army's repatriation orders grew more urgent. The war was over. The prisoners had to go home. Yet the human heart had no schedule. One of the final trains to leave a Texas camp carried hundreds of German prisoners. The journey to the East Coast was supposed to be their first step toward freedom, but for many, it felt like exile. Inside one of the rail cars sat a young woman who had worked in the camp infirmary. She pressed her forehead against the window as the plane slipped by, her eyes following every distant farmhouse, every piece of land that now held her story. In her pocket was a folded photograph of a man in a worn uniform, a camp guard who had once brought her books and shared stories about his family's ranch outside Waco. Their love had grown quietly, carefully, under the watch of others who pretended not to notice. Now, as the train rattled eastward, she whispered his name as if it might slow the miles between them. At the same time, he was standing on that ranch, watching the horizon in silence. The war had taken his youth. The army had given him duty, order, and a sense of belonging. But it had also taken something far greater, the chance to be with her. In letters that would never reach their destination, he wrote of the wind across the plains, the sound of cattle in the distance, the way the evening sky turned gold before fading to gray. He promised to wait, even if waiting meant years. As the trains carried the prisoners to the coast, others remained behind for a few final weeks. In those days, Texas became a strange crossroads of endings and beginnings. Guards shared coffee with prisoners. Local families brought food and said goodbye. Many had stopped seeing the Germans as enemies. They were simply people who had worked hard, treated others kindly, and suffered like everyone else. A local paper described it best. They came as prisoners, but they leave as friends. Still, for every friendship, there was a heartbreak. Some of the German women tried desperately to stay. A few even petitioned the War Department, citing humanitarian reasons, medical issues, or local sponsorship. Almost all were denied. Policy was policy. America, in its victory, could not be seen as harboring those who had worn the enemy's uniform, even if that uniform had long been shed. But a few stories slipped through the cracks. In 1946, records showed that a small number of former German prisoners were allowed to return to the U.S. through marriage, sponsorship, or employment. Among them were women who had once worked in Texas camps. They arrived not as prisoners, but as immigrants, stepping back onto American soil to reunite with the people they had once been forbidden to love. For them, the dream of return was not born of politics, but of something deeply human, the desire to belong to the place where their hearts had found peace. One such woman, according to archival accounts from Camp Hearn, returned years later under a new name. She had married the guard who once watched her from across the barbed wire. Their early letters had been censored, returned, or destroyed, but persistence found its way. He had written through intermediaries, through church networks, through anyone willing to forward a letter across the ocean. It took nearly 3 years for her visa to be approved. When she finally stepped off the ship in New York, she carried nothing but a small suitcase and a photograph of the Texas sky. Their reunion was quiet, without fanfare or ceremony. He met her at the train station, older, thinner, but still the same man she had dreamed of. She was nervous, clutching her papers like a shield. When their eyes met, the years between them seemed to vanish. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. The war had begun with walls and wire. It ended for them in the open air of Texas, beneath the same endless sky. Others weren't as lucky. Many never saw each other again. Some American soldiers died before their letters reached Europe. Some German women married within the ruins of their homeland, trying to rebuild from ashes. Yet the memory of what they had found in Texas, the brief, improbable warmth of connection, stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Decades later, their children and grandchildren would uncover letters, diaries, or faded photographs of Americans standing beside smiling German women in front of old camp fences. The true power of these stories isn't in their rarity, but in their quiet defiance. They challenged everything war was supposed to mean. In a time when hatred was taught and separation enforced, these men and women discovered that kindness could cross even the harshest boundaries. They were proof that love, once found, does not ask for permission to exist. As the 1940s faded into the 1950s, the world moved on. Texas grew, modernized, and forgot the fences that had once divided it. The camps turned to farmland, schools, and open fields. Only the locals remembered. And sometimes, when the wind blew a certain way, someone would say, "There used to be Germans out there once." They said it softly, almost fondly. And somewhere, in an old farmhouse, a woman with a soft accent would look out across the land and smile, because she knew it was true. When the war finally ended and the last POW trains departed from Texas, it seemed as if the state itself exhaled. A long, tired sigh after years of quiet duty. The fences came down, the guard towers were dismantled, and the camps that had once held thousands of German prisoners began to fade from the landscape. Within months, fields reclaimed the open ground, and the traces of captivity disappeared into the soil. But history has a way of leaving echoes. The stories of what had happened there. The work, the laughter, the small rebellions of humanity refused to vanish. For most Americans, the return to peace meant a rush toward normal life, homecomings, marriages, and the booming optimism of post-war prosperity. For the former guards and townspeople of Texas, though, the memories of the POW camps carried a strange quiet weight. Many had learned that the men and women they once called enemy were no longer symbols of a distant ideology, but people, sometimes more disciplined, polite, and hard-working than expected. The war had forced the world into divisions, but here, behind the fences of Texas, those divisions had softened. Letters continued to cross the ocean long after the camps closed. The American Postal Service, overwhelmed with correspondence between former enemies, eventually began to forward hundreds of such letters to Germany, each marked, censored, but permitted. Some carried photos of farms, families, or weddings. Others were simply notes of thanks. "For your kindness during difficult times," one German prisoner wrote to a Texan family. "You treated me as a man when the world told you not to." Among these exchanges were the letters that told deeper, more personal stories. Stories of connection that had refused to die with the war. The marriages between American soldiers or guards and former German prisoners were few but remarkable. In official records, they appeared as bureaucratic curiosities. Special cases, requiring presidential waivers or State Department approval. But behind those words lay years of waiting, paperwork, and hope. In 1947, Congress began to ease restrictions on marriage between U.S. citizens and foreign nationals from former enemy countries. It was a slow process, tangled in suspicion and politics, but love has a way of persisting beyond regulations. By 1948 and 1949, small groups of German war brides began arriving on American soil, most from Europe, a handful from the old Texas camps. They were greeted not as enemies, but as wives and mothers, stepping into the post-war dream of new beginnings. Some settled in the very towns that had once held them captive. The irony was never lost on the locals. "We used to guard them," one man recalled in an interview decades later. "And now we're neighbors." Yet no one resented it. These women had become part of the fabric of the community. They baked bread, worked on farms, sent their children to local schools, and joined church gatherings. Their accents faded slowly, but never completely. And every so often, someone would notice a faint melody of German sung over the fields. The legacy of the Texas POW camps soon took on a peculiar duality. Officially, they were considered examples of America's adherence to humane treatment and international law. Unofficially, they became remembered as places where humanity triumphed over ideology, where decency had quietly undermined propaganda. The guards, many of them young and weary from years of service, often said the experience changed them more than any battle could. One recalled decades later, I learned more about the meaning of peace behind those fences than I ever did in combat. The local newspapers, which had once published careful reports about the camps, began revisiting the stories in the 1950s and 1960s as nostalgia took hold. Reporters sought out former guards, farmers, and even returning Germans. They found old friendships rekindled across continents. One Texas farmer was known to have hosted a former prisoner's son decades later. The son came just to see the land his father had once worked as a captive. The visit ended with a barbecue, laughter, and a handshake that bridged 70 years. For historians, the Texas POW experience became a window into something larger: the resilience of human empathy even during total war. Between 1943 and 1946, over 400,000 German prisoners were held in the United States, and more than 50,000 of them in Texas alone. The vast majority returned home quietly, but a few stayed, legally or not, and built lives that defied every expectation. Their presence became woven into the unspoken heritage of the region, lingering in local memory like a faint echo of a long-forgotten song. Yet even as the story softened over time, one truth remained. What had happened in Texas could only have happened there. The combination of open land, hard work, and the stubborn independence of the people created an environment where even enemies could rediscover their humanity. The fences that had once divided them became symbolic of something else entirely. Not barriers, but bridges. By the 1970s, historians and journalists began tracking down the few surviving women who had been among the German auxiliaries held in those camps. Many were reluctant to speak, fearful of misunderstanding or judgment, but a few agreed. Their recollections were gentle, full of gratitude and wistful longing. One woman, interviewed for a Texas newspaper, put it simply: "In Germany, the war was everything. In Texas, I learned what peace felt like." For her and others like her, Texas was not just a place of captivity. It was the beginning of forgiveness, the quiet soil where the seeds of reconciliation first took root. And as the last traces of the camps disappeared beneath pastures and towns, those seeds continued to grow, unseen but enduring, carried on in the lives of those who never forgot. The story was not over yet, because while the war had ended, the choices made in its shadow were still shaping what came after. By the 1980s, the story of the German prisoners in Texas had begun to re-emerge, not as a classified chapter of wartime policy, but as a human tale that refused to die. Scholars and local historians unearthed documents, letters, and photographs from dusty archives, piecing together the fragments of a time when enemies learned to live side by side. What they found surprised even them. The Texas camps had not merely been detention sites. They had been living communities where the boundaries between captor and captive had quietly blurred. Old photographs told much of the story. Smiling German men standing beside American guards, a Christmas tree set up in a mess hall, women in pressed uniforms working in camp hospitals, and even local farmers posing with their wartime labor crews. The images challenged decades of black and white wartime narratives. Here there were no villains or heroes, only people, caught in a strange moment of suspended conflict, doing their best to hold on to decency. The stories of the women, the few German auxiliaries sent to Texas, became central to this rediscovery. They were nurses, clerks, translators, and sometimes the quiet thread connecting two worlds. Many of them had been young, barely out of school, when they found themselves across the ocean, in a land so vast and foreign it seemed unreal. For some, Texas became a place of healing. They spoke of kindness shown by local families, of children who waved at them, of guards who treated them not as prisoners but as guests. One woman later recalled, "It was strange. We were the defeated, yet in that place, I felt free for the first time." The passage of time softened the stigma of their past. In both Germany and America, The post-war generation began to see their parents' and grandparents' stories through a different lens, not of guilt or ideology, but of humanity. The Texas POW experience stood as proof that even amid global hatred, compassion could thrive. By the time documentaries and books began to revisit the subject in the 1990s and 2000s, many of the surviving participants were elderly. Yet their memories remained sharp. Some still kept mementos, small tokens that carried a lifetime of meaning. A handkerchief, a photograph, a pressed flower, a folded letter signed only with initials. A recurring theme emerged from their recollections. Texas had changed them. For the Germans, it had reshaped what America meant. They had arrived expecting hostility but found respect. For the Americans, it had challenged everything they thought they knew about their enemy. One former guard, interviewed in his 80s, said, "We thought we'd be watching monsters. Turned out they were just boys and girls who'd been fed the same lies we were." But among these recollections were also the rare, extraordinary stories of those who stayed or came back. Historical immigration records reveal that several dozen former German prisoners eventually returned to the U.S. to live permanently. Many settled quietly in Texas. They married locals, raised families, and worked on the same land where they had once labored as prisoners. Their children grew up with American accents, attending schools that stood only miles from where the barbed wire had been. To them, the camps were ancient history, but for their parents, they were sacred ground. Every few years, reunions began to take place. Former prisoners traveled from Germany to Texas, walking through the open fields where their barracks once stood. Some found only faint depressions in the soil or a few scattered concrete foundations. Yet for them, those sites held power, the place where their lives had turned. At one such reunion, a frail woman who had once worked in a Texas infirmary stood beside her daughter, looking over the grassland where the camp had been. "This," she whispered, "was where I stopped being afraid." As the years passed, these stories gained symbolic importance far beyond Texas. They were cited by historians and educators as examples of reconciliation in practice, living proof that humanity could survive even in the machinery of war. In German schools, some of the women's stories were used to teach post-war generations about forgiveness. In American classrooms, teachers pointed to Texas as an example of moral strength, where a victorious nation chose dignity over revenge. Today, little remains of those wartime camps. A few historical markers dot the countryside: Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, Camp Mexia, each with plaques explaining what once stood there. Local museums preserve fragments, spoons, letters, uniforms, and handmade crafts carved from scrap wood by the prisoners. But the most powerful legacy isn't in those artifacts. It lives in the stories passed quietly through families, in the understanding that even when nations are at war, individuals can still choose compassion. The women who once crossed oceans in defeat left behind something larger than their own survival, a legacy of empathy that rippled through generations. Some never returned to Germany. Some did, only to realize that a part of them had remained forever in the wide-open land of Texas. A few were buried there, their graves marked by simple stones inscribed with English names and faint German prayers. And so, the story of the German prisoners in Texas became less about war and more about transformation. It showed that peace is not merely the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding. A lesson learned not on the battlefield, but in the everyday kindness between strangers. When the last of those women passed away in the early 2000s, local obituaries often included a curious line: "She came as a prisoner and stayed as a Texan." Few phrases could better capture the quiet miracle of what had happened there. Their story endures, not through monuments or parades, but through the memory of what humanity can become when it chooses compassion over hatred. The story of the German prisoners in Texas does not end with fences or freedom. It ends with something far quieter: the slow, enduring realization that even in war, the human heart remains undefeated. When the world was divided by hatred and fear, these men and women, both American and German, found a way to see each other not as enemies, but as reflections of themselves. It was a small miracle born in a forgotten corner of history, yet its message reached far beyond its time. The war had been fought with weapons, ideologies, and fire, but what happened in those Texas camps revealed another kind of power, the power of simple decency. Behind barbed wire meant for containment, people shared bread, laughter, and words that reached across languages. The same land that once served as a symbol of captivity became, for some, the first place they ever felt truly free. For the German women who came as prisoners and chose to stay, Texas became more than a home. It became a testament to the possibility of forgiveness. Their lives bridged two worlds that had once sworn to destroy each other. In their marriages, their children, and their quiet acceptance by the communities that had once guarded them, they proved that reconciliation isn't written in treaties. It is written in human hearts. Decades later, when historians ask how enemies became neighbors, how barbed wire turned into wedding rings, the answer lies not in policy or chance, but in courage. The quiet courage to see the person beyond the uniform, to act kindly when the world expected bitterness. That courage, simple and unrecorded, shaped more of the post-war world than most battles ever did. The wind still moves across those old Texas fields, carrying the faint echoes of a time when compassion defied the logic of war. The camps are gone, their walls forgotten, but their legacy remains. In every handshake between former foes, in every act of mercy born from memory. They came as prisoners. They found love. And many never went home, not because they were trapped, but because they were finally free.